So if you look at pretty much every large-scale social engineering project in history
Right.
that has ever tried to create unity by, eliminating difference, it basically produces one of two things.
Tyranny or collapse.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Tyranny or total systemic collapse.
Yeah.
And usually it's both. I mean, look at the grand sweep of human history, and you see this terrifying, almost mechanical pattern just repeating itself over and over.
Yeah, it really is mechanical.
It is. You have planners, emperors, visionaries, whoever, and they look at the messy, chaotic reality of human diversity, and they decide it's a bug in the system.
A glitch that needs fixing.
Right. They decide that for society to function optimally, everyone simply must operate the exact same parameters. Think about the Soviet project in the 20th century.
Oh, perfect example.
The goal there wasn't just political dominance, It was the creation of Homo Sovieticus, like this singular, homogeneous Soviet citizen.
And achieving that required incredible violence.
Unbelievable violence. It meant the forceful erasure of nomadic cultures in Kazakhstan, the crushing of independent agricultural systems in Ukraine, the violent suppression of local dialects, economic diversity, everything.
No, because the system demanded absolute uniformity.
Yes. And the result was, what, catastrophic famine, the Gulag system, and eventually the complete implosion of the entire empire.
Well, and you can see the exact same thing in the colonial projects of the 18th and 19th centuries, too.
Right, totally.
It operated on the exact same assumption, just, wrapped in different branding. They called it a civilizing mission.
Right, the civilizing mission.
Exactly. So the imperial centers in London or Paris or Madrid, they looked at this staggering diversity of global indigenous populations.
Which were incredibly complex.
Oh, wildly complex. Cultures with entirely different agricultural practices, radically different concepts of property, distinct methods of, dispute resolution. And the empire saw all of it as a defect.
Just bad code. Yeah, bad code. And the response was always assimilation at the barrel of a gun. I mean, they dismantled local ecological practices just to plant standardized cash crops.
Right.
They built residential schools designed specifically to break the transmission of distinct cultural identities. Because the underlying belief was always that harmony could only be achieved through homogeneity.
And the crazy part is, we haven't learned the lesson at all. We still see this today.
Oh, everywhere.
You see it in hyper-nationalist movements demanding the erasure of minority identities just to build some mythic, unified nation-state.
Yep.
You even see it in, modern corporate monopolies that try to force every user worldwide into a single, flattened algorithmic experience.
Right. The algorithm wants everyone to be the same person.
Exactly. The foundational myth of our time is that differences in social systems, operating principles, cultural architectures, that these are problems to be solved. We're just obsessed with the idea that the ideal state of humanity is a single, perfectly blended smoothie.
A terrible gray smoothie. Right. But today, in this deep dive, we are going to look at a text that takes that myth and completely shatters it.
I'm so excited for this one.
Me too. We are diving into an analysis of a foundational document. Specifically, we're looking at verses 53 through 58 of Al-Furqan, as analyzed by the thinker G.A. Parwez.
Right.
But listen, we're looking at this strictly as a masterclass in civilizational survival. We're not doing a theological reading here.
No, absolutely not.
We're approaching this the way systems engineers would dissect a blueprint for a sustainable social architecture.
Which is exactly how Parwez approaches it. And it starts with verse 53, which contains, honestly, one of the most precise, mechanically rigorous statements of functional diversity you will find in any foundational text.
Lay it out for us.
So to translate the classical Arabic into our working systems framework, it basically says, he is the one who released the two seas, this one fresh and sweet, this one salt and bitter, and placed between them a Barzakh and a protected barrier.
Okay, the two C's.
Right. The text introduces this radical counter-principle to the homogeneity myth. It posits two massive bodies of water, and they're flowing right in proximity to each other.
And that dissect.
Exactly. But they possess entirely different chemical compositions. They operate on totally different ecological parameters. And the crucial thing here, the functional architecture of the world requires that both exist, without one overriding the other.
Okay, let's stick with the terraforming and ecological implications here for a second before we map it onto human sociology, because I think it helps to visualize it.
Sure.
You have a fresh, sweet water system and a salty, bitter water system. Now, if I am an optimistic, slightly naive social engineer, my immediate instinct is to look at the bitter, salty sea and say, well, that's unpalatable. We can't drink that.
Right. It tastes bad. Let's fix it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We need to build a massive desalination plant and turn all that salt water into fresh water. You want to fix the salt water. Or, conversely, the salt water wants to conquer the fresh water. But if you actually do that in a real ecosystem, say like where a river meets the ocean, you don't create a utopia. You cause a mass extinction event.
You completely obliterate the biosphere.
Right.
Because the ocean has a regulatory role in the global climate that a freshwater river simply cannot perform.
It's a completely different function.
Exactly. It acts as a massive carbon sink, right?
Yeah.
It regulates global temperatures through these deep water currents. It sustains a very specific biological food web.
Yeah.
And then the freshwater river, on the other hand, brings nutrients down from the mountains. It carves out topsoil. It creates floodplains that sustain terrestrial agriculture. The whole value of that planetary ecosystem is precisely that both systems exist and both perform entirely different functions.
Right. If you try to, like, homogenize them into one giant brackish puddle, you lose the specific utility of both.
You just get a dead zone.
You get a dead zone. So, mapping this onto human groups, we aren't talking about literal underground aquifers here. We are talking about human ideologies, social frameworks, and communities that are operating in the same physical and temporal space.
Yeah, and Parwez frames this as the inevitable reality of human civilization. You've got one group, represented by the freshwater, and they operate on what we can call the principles of the rational order.
Okay, the rational order.
Right. These are communities organized around objective truths, constructive social practices, permanent ethical laws.
So highly functional, positive operating principles.
Exactly. And then the other group, the salt and bitter water, they operate on entirely different principles. They might be adversarial, they might be heavily flawed, or maybe they just prioritize different values, you know.
Like what?
Well, maybe one is highly mercantile while the other is highly agrarian. Or perhaps one relies strictly on tradition while the other relies on aggressive innovation. The text is making this definitive architectural statement. These differing frameworks will exist simultaneously. Attempting to force the salt water to behave like fresh water, or vice versa, is not just tyrannical, it's systemically inefficient.
So the text is actually giving us an anti-fragility mandate here.
Basically, yes.
It's saying the sheer existence of differing operating frameworks isn't an error to be corrected. But, okay, I have to push back here.
Go for it.
Because on paper, let the two seas exist side by side. Sounds beautiful.
Yeah.
Sounds like a great bumper sticker. But in reality, water mixes.
It does.
If you put fresh water and salt water in the same basin, entropy just takes over. They bleed into one another. Or, more likely in human history, one sea tries to swallow the other one whole.
Right, imperialism.
Yeah. If you have a society operating on a rational, constructive order, sitting right next to a society operating on a highly aggressive, adversarial, exploitative order, how do they not just destroy each other? I mean, how do you prevent the friction from burning the whole system down?
Well, the mechanism that prevents that collapse is the core of this entire socioeconomic blueprint.
Okay.
The verse explicitly states that between the two seas is a Barzakh and a Hijran Majura.
A Barzakh.
Right. And this requires us to look really closely at the classical Arabic because we so often import these heavily baggage-laden English translations that totally distort the actual mechanics being described here.
Oh, absolutely. Translation is always a minefield.
Exactly. So when people hear the word barrier, which is how it's usually translated, they envision, like the Berlin Wall.
Right.
They envision a militarized border with guard towers and barbed wire.
Yeah, the immediate visualization is total isolation. Putting the fresh water in a steel vault so the salt water can't even touch it.
But a Barzakh is not a physical brick wall. In classical Arabic linguistic usage, a Barzakh is an interval.
An interval.
Yes, it is a liminal zone. It is a functional interface that maintains distinction without requiring absolute separation. It is literally the space between things that allows them to be distinct entities while still existing in the same overarching environment.
Oh, that is exactly how modern software architecture works.
Really? Tell me.
Yeah. A Barzakh is an API, an application programming interface.
Oh, I love that. Unpack that.
Okay, so let's say you have a massive, clunky, decades-old legacy banking system, right? And it's running on this ancient mainframe code. And right next to it, the bank wants to launch a sleek, modern, highly dynamic mobile application for their users.
Right.
If you just dump the modern apps code into the legacy mainframe, the entire bank would crash immediately. The operating languages are totally incompatible. The logic is different. The parameters are completely different.
They are the two Cs.
Exactly. They are the two Cs. So how do you get them to function on the same network without blowing up the server?
Right, you can't just mash them together.
No. You don't rewrite the legacy system to match the app, because that would take years and billions of dollars. And you don't downgrade the app to match the mainframe. You build an API.
The Barzakh.
The Barzakh. The API sits between them as a liminal zone. It acts as a translator and a strict gatekeeper.
Okay.
So if the mobile app needs to know an account balance, it sends a highly specific request to the API. The API catches it, translates that request into a format the old legacy system understands. The legacy system spits out the number, the API packages it safely, and hands it back to the app.
Wow.
They're in constant contact, right? They're exchanging vital resources all day long. But the API ensures that the legacy system's code never overwrites the app's database. They remain totally distinct, yet highly interactive and productive. The API manages the friction.
That is the perfect modern visualization of the Barzakh. It's an interface that allows diverse functional systems to interact safely. And Parwez argues that a productive society actually requires these interfaces. Think about international trade or federalist political systems or even secular legal frameworks that allow distinct cultural communities to resolve internal disputes without imposing those specific cultural rules on the broader public.
Right.
Those legal and economic frameworks are the Barzakh.
But APIs only work if they are actively monitored and secured.
Right.
If someone hacks the API or if the API protocol just decays over time from neglect, the systems crash into each other. Which brings us to the second phrase you mentioned, Hijran Majura.
Yes, the Hijran Majura. The word hijr relates to a boundary, an enclosure, or some kind of restriction. But there is a crucial linguistic nuance here that Parwez points out.
Okay, what is it?
In other contexts, this root word can mean something abandoned or shunned, like a negative isolation. Think of a quarantine.
Oh, right, like shutting someone away.
Exactly. But Hijran Majura in the specific grammatical form implies a protected, actively maintained boundary. It is positive and structural. You don't just build the API and walk away and hope for the best.
You maintain the security protocols.
You actively maintain the security protocol.
Okay, hold on. I need to play devil's advocate here for a second.
Go ahead.
Because if you actively protect the boundary between two distinct groups, like if you say, we are going to ensure Group A and Group B remain fundamentally distinct, and we are going to fiercely maintain the barrier between them, isn't that just a sanitized way of describing segregation? I mean, how is Hijran Majura functionally different from historical redlining or even apartheid?
Yeah.
On paper, keeping groups distinct sounds incredibly dangerous to modern ears.
I get why you'd say that, but it's fundamentally different. Segregation and apartheid are mechanisms of resource hoarding.
Resource hoarding.
Yes, they are walls built by one sea to prevent the other sea from accessing the sunlight, the nutrients, the literal space required to thrive.
Ah, okay.
Apartheid is a system where the freshwater decides that the saltwater is structurally inferior and must be isolated to prevent contamination, actively starving it of resources.
Right. It's parasitic.
Exactly. A Barzakh, by contrast, is a mechanism of resource exchange. Your API doesn't prevent the mobile app from accessing the bank's data. It facilitates it safely.
Right.
So the Hijran Majura is the active protection of the interface, not the active oppression of the people. It is protecting the right of the salt water to be salt water and the right of the fresh water to be fresh water.
So segregation is a wall built to starve a system. But a Barzakh is a membrane built to allow respiration.
Precisely. If we return to the physiological metaphor, look at the human body.
Okay.
The blood system and the lymphatic system run parallel to each other throughout your entire body.
Right.
They carry entirely different fluids with completely different chemical compositions and different cellular structures. They absolutely must remain distinct. If lymphatic fluid floods your cardiovascular system uncontrollably, you go into shock and die.
Yeah, that's bad.
But they interface constantly at the capillary level, exchanging nutrients and waste. The capillary wall is the Barzakh.
Oh, that's brilliant.
It is a maintained boundary, a Hijran Majura, that allows the whole organism to survive. If you apply the homogeneity myth to the human body and try to blend the blood and the lymph into one fluid to make them equal, the patient dies immediately.
Wow. This really flips our modern socio-political discourse completely on its head.
It really does.
Because we spend endless amounts of political and social energy trying to turn the salt water fresh, We argue on social media. We try to pass these sweeping mandates. We try to force ideological assimilation on everyone we disagree with.
Yeah, we want everyone to be freshwater.
Right. We view the friction between different cultural or ideological groups as a failure of society.
Right.
But this text is arguing that the existence of different operating principles isn't the failure. The failure is our inability to build a competent API.
Yes. Parwez refers to this as escaping the tyranny of unproven assertions.
The tyranny of unproven assertions.
Right. The assertion that the saltwater sea is universally inferior and must be converted is an unproven assertion. The assertion that the freshwater sea is invalid is an unproven assertion. The principle of the two seas rejects these universalist claims entirely in favor of functional diversity.
Okay.
The rational order does not demand that everyone behave exactly the same way. It provides a framework, the API, where multiple differing systems can engage in trade, diplomacy, and intellectual exchange without demanding assimilation.
Okay, let's zoom in a bit. Let's move from the macro level of, competing civilizational seas down to the micro level, because a society isn't just massive abstract blocks of ideology.
Yeah, it's not.
It is built out of individual human beings networking together. And how does this system handle the messy reality of human relationships? Because humans are tribal. We don't naturally want to build APIs. We naturally want to build moats.
We love a good moat.
We do. Which brings us to verse 54, which keeps this biological metaphor going but shifts the focus.
Yeah, verse 54 states, "He who created from water a human being and made them into nasab and ar."
Okay.
So we are maintaining that ecological through-line water as the fundamental engine of life and organization. But out of this biological reality, the text identifies the two fundamental nodes of human network architecture, nasab and sir.
Okay, let's define the variables for the listener here. What exactly is nasab?
Nasab refers to lineage. It is biological kinship, your bloodlines, your ancestors, your genetic tribe. It is the vertical transmission of identity through time.
Got it. It's the water flowing downward from a spring. You don't choose your nasab. You don't choose your parents or your genetic predispositions. You are simply born into that specific stream.
Exactly. You inherit it. And then you have sir. This refers to a final kin.
Meaning in-laws.
Right. These are the relationships formed by marriage, your in-laws, your chosen relationships. It is the horizontal connection between different streams.
Okay, so blood and marriage, biological bonds and chosen bonds.
Yeah.
Now, from a systems design perspective, the text does something incredibly deliberate here. It places nasab and sir on the exact same grammatical and structural level.
It does.
They are presented as equal halves of the human organizational equation. And this is where the source material gets brutally honest about human sociology, because human beings practically never treat these two networks as equal.
Never. We have a deeply ingrained tribal bias that elevates the biological over the chosen, and Parwez dives deep into the cultural realities of this. He specifically looks at the local Punjabi context as sort of microcosm for this universal human flaw.
Right.
In that culture, and frankly in almost every agrarian and historical culture globally, the lineage, the nasab is everything. Your family name, your bloodline, your ancestors. That is the ultimate source of your pride, your legal standing, and your social worth.
And how do they typically treat the sir, the in-laws?
With varying degrees of suspicion, mockery, and systemic disrespect. Yeah. Parwez points out a fascinating sociolinguistic reality. In that culture, the common words for a final kin, like the literal terms for brother-in-law or father-in-law, are actually used as street insults. They are swear words.
Think about the psychology of that. You use the word for the family you choose to merge with as a literal insult.
It's wild.
It reveals a massive societal prejudice. It implies that being an in-law means you are in a subordinate, inherently weaker, or untrustworthy position.
Yes.
And we see variations of this everywhere, not just there. The universal trope of the monster-in-law.
Oh, yeah.
The endless stand-up jokes about avoiding your spouse's family. The mafia movie mentality of blood is thicker than water, which implies that chosen family is fragile and biological family is ironclad. We inherently distrust the horizontal network.
We do, and that distrust is fatal to the scalability of a civilization.
How so?
Well, why does this foundational text explicitly put nasab and sir on parity? Because of the mathematics of network theory. Think about what happens if you try to build a society utilizing only nasab.
If I only trust my biological bloodline, my network stops at Dunbar's number. It stops in my immediate clan.
Exactly. It creates insularity. A purely nasab-based society simply cannot scale into a civilization. It inevitably fractures into isolated, xenophobic tribes.
Because Everyone else is an outsider.
Right. If anyone outside your bloodline is viewed as an inherent threat or a lesser entity, you have no mechanism for trade, no mechanism for exchanging ideas, and no mechanism for managing resources across a large geography.
You just get endless cyclical blood feuds. You get genetic and intellectual stagnation.
It's the ultimate gated community, but eventually the gates rust and everyone inside starves.
Right. On the flip side, what happens if you only have Sir? What if you try to build a society purely on chosen bonds, entirely rejecting intergenerational continuity and biological roots?
Then you get an atomized, deeply fragile society.
Yeah.
If there is no respect for the deep vertical roots of Nazab, society becomes unmoored. It just becomes a collection of highly temporary, transactional relationships.
No foundation.
Exactly. The combination of Nasab and Sir produces the complete, resilient social network. It balances the deep, stabilizing biological roots with the expansive, relationally extended community. The rational order requires both the vertical integration of Nasab to provide stability over time and the horizontal expansion of Sir to bridge diverse groups across space.
Let's tie this right back to our API metaphor and the two C's.
Let's do it.
Your NASAB, your biological family, is your local server. It's where your core data is stored. Your final connections is the API that allows your local server to securely connect to entirely different networks.
Yes.
If you claim that your local server is the only valid hardware in the world and refuse to build APIs, you are disconnected from the global internet. You are useless.
And if you claim that Nasab is inherently superior to Sir, you are falling right back into the tyranny of unproven assertions.
Yep.
The fresh water of your biological kinship does not invalidate the salt water of the family you marry into. Parwez makes a very grounded point about how this macro-sociological theory applies to the micro level of a single household. He argues that if a man expects his wife to respect his parents, which is his nisab, he is logically and systemically obligated to equally respect her parents, which represents her nisab, but functions as his Sir.
Because if you don't establish that parity, the API breaks.
It crashes.
If the husband treats his bloodline as royal and her bloodline as subordinate, he introduces a fatal bug into the household's operating system. The household collapses into resentment and conflict.
Exactly.
And if you scale that broken API up to the level of a nation where, say, one ethnic group views its nasab as superior to the Sir connections it makes with minority groups, well, you get the structural inequality that leads to civil war.
The synthesis is absolutely mandatory. True civilizational scale requires functional diversity. The networks must intertwine with mutual respect, governed by laws that enforce that parity.
Okay, so we have a brilliant theoretical architecture here.
We do.
We have the two C's flowing side by side. We have the API, the Barzakh, managing the friction and preventing systemic collapse.
Right.
We have a society networked vertically by blood and horizontally by chosen bonds, maintaining parity. It's a gorgeous blueprint.
Right.
But any systems engineer, any software developer will tell you that you can build the most elegant, heavily encrypted, perfectly load-balanced system in the world, and it will still crash.
Yeah.
Because of the ultimate vulnerability.
User error.
Exactly. User error.
Yeah.
The human element. Which brings us to verse 55 and the concept of smashing the personality cult.
Oh, this section. This is perhaps the most intellectually demanding part of Parwez's analysis because it requires us to look in the mirror at our own psychological weaknesses.
Been uncomfortable.
Very, because the architecture of the two C's will fail if the human beings operating the system decide to worship the system administrators instead of relying on the system itself.
Wow.
Verse 55 says, "They serve or worship that which can neither benefit them nor harm them."
Now, historically, the classical, almost cartoonish interpretation of this verse is about ancient people bowing to statues of stone or wood.
Right. Literal idolatry.
And it's so easy for modern people to read that and say, well, I don't pray to a golden calf, so this doesn't apply to me. I'm highly rational. But Parwez takes a systems approach here. He argues this has nothing to do with museum artifacts. This is about the institutionalized worship of human beings.
Yes. It is about the human propensity to construct personality cults. It is about the catastrophic decision to subordinate your critical thinking, your autonomy, and your rational faculties to a human leader, a cleric, a politician, or some institutional figurehead.
Right.
The text is launching a vicious critique against those who serve entities that possess no inherent permanent power to benefit or harm them, outside of the artificial power that the followers voluntarily project onto them.
Let's unpack the psychology of why we do this, because it is a deeply embedded bug in human software. We're desperate to put someone on a pedestal. We want to be told what to do. Why?
Because it's easier.
Because maintaining this system is exhausting.
It really is.
Think about the cognitive load required to operate in a society of functional diversity. You have to constantly monitor the API. You have to evaluate the validity of differing claims. You have to manage the friction between your NASAV and your SIR. You have to constantly engage your prefrontal cortex to navigate a complex, diverse reality.
It induces massive decision fatigue.
Yes. And what is the easiest way to relieve decision fatigue? You find a charismatic figure with a loud voice and absolute certainty, and you hand them root access to your brain.
You just outsource the thinking.
You say, I'm tired of processing all this complex data. You just tell me what is right and wrong. Make the world simple for me. We surrender our autonomy because subordination relieves us of the responsibility of critical thinking.
We prefer the comfort of a dictator over the cognitive labor of a free society.
That is a brilliant way to put it.
But the rational order outlined in this foundational text is aggressively supreme over the individual. It is designed to liberate humanity from personality worship. And it does this by emphasizing a point that completely upends traditional religious and political hierarchies.
Which is?
It asserts that even the most revered figures in history, the prophets, the messengers, were fundamentally just human beings operating within the system. They were not the system itself.
Parwez hits this point hard, doesn't he?
Extremely hard. He shows that the messengers of the text actively dismantled the mechanisms of personality cults as they were forming. They didn't encourage them.
Right, they shut them down.
They repeatedly and explicitly stated, I am a human being like you. They did not ask for unquestioning servitude. In fact, they specifically stated, I do not ask you for any financial reward or compensation for this message.
The financial piece is huge.
Huge, because they refuse to monetize their leadership, which is the primary mechanism of cult formation. If a leader demands financial tribute, or if they demand unquestioning blind obedience that contradicts objective reasoning, they are operating outside the rational order. They are attempting to hijack the system to become the object of worship.
We really need to ground this in reality, because the consequences of handing over root access to a human administrator are absurd and honestly often tragic.
Yeah.
The source material contains a story that illustrates perfectly what happens when a community unplugs its collective brain and defers entirely to a clerical authority, the story of the village in Sialkot.
Oh, man. This story is a profound case study in the pathology of subordination.
It really is. Let's walk through the sociology of this. So, Parwez recounts an event in a village where a young, unmarried woman dies. It's a tragedy.
Of course.
The family prepares the body, they dig the grave, and the entire community gathers at the graveyard for the funeral prayer. It is a standard, solemn, socially necessary procedure. But then, the local cleric, the religious authority figure, the man whom the village has granted unquestionable root access over their social operating system, steps forward and halts everything.
He stops the funeral.
He stops it cold. He announces that, according to his highly specific, esoteric interpretation of religious law, it is forbidden to perform a funeral prayer for an adult woman who is unmarried.
He literally creates an artificial systemic block. The system of human empathy and social closure is functioning perfectly, but the administrator imposes a firewall based purely on his asserted authority.
Exactly. So the family is in absolute shock. The body is lying right there. The grave is open. The sun is beating down. They ask him, well, what is the workaround? We have to bury our daughter.
Right. What do we do?
And this is where the cognitive collapse happens. The cleric looks around the graveyard, spots a shisham tree, just a common local tree, and declares a solution. He says, I will perform a marriage ceremony between the deceased girl and this tree. Once she is officially married to the tree, she is legally no longer a spinster. And then the law allows me to perform the funeral prayer.
The absurdity of the proposition is just staggering. It violates basic biology, basic contract law, and fundamental human dignity.
But what does the village do? Do they laugh him out of the graveyard? Do they say, you are a lunatic, step aside, we are burying this girl?
No.
No. They obey. The villagers actually gather around. The cleric performs a marriage ritual between a human corpse and a piece of wood. They distribute the traditional sweets to celebrate the wedding, and only then does the cleric graciously allow the funeral to proceed.
It's unbelievable. But the question Parwez forces us to ask is, how do otherwise intelligent, functioning adult humans submit to such profound absurdity?
Because they had uninstalled their own API.
Yeah.
They were no longer interfacing with reality. They were only interfacing with the cleric.
They had replaced the permanent principles of a rational, objective system with the contingent, deeply flawed authority of a human institution. When a community elevates a human being to the status of an unquestionable arbiter, they turn off the engine of reason entirely.
They just shut it down.
You are no longer navigating the functional diversity of the two seas. You have drained the ocean and are living in whatever puddle the cleric or the politician dictates today.
Right.
The text insists that the system itself, the objective rational order, is supreme. The foundational architecture is explicitly designed to smash the idol of human subordination so that the human mind can freely engage with reality.
But this leaves us with a massive void, doesn't it?
How so?
If I am explicitly forbidden from relying on human institutions, if I cannot rely on the brilliance of a charismatic founder, or the authority of a high priest, or the dictates of a supreme leader, what actually sustains the social architecture? If all the human administrators are flawed and temporary, what powers the Barzakh? What keeps the API running?
This brings us to the final component of the blueprint, the concept of the law of requital and true tawakkul.
Okay, let's get into it.
We find this in verse 58. The text gives this final directive. Put your trust or your reliance on the living one who does not die. Watawakkal alai aladi la yamutu.
Now, tawakkul is a word that has been heavily corrupted by centuries of fatalism.
Oh, completely distorted.
When the average person hears tawakkul, they translate it as passive resignation. It's the Jesus take the wheel philosophy.
Right.
It's the idea that human effort is ultimately pointless, so you should just sit on the couch, cross your arms, and let the universe handle the complex logistics of your life.
Which is a complete inversion of the text's actual framework. In the system's architecture, tawakkul is not passive resignation. It is a highly aggressive, strategic choice.
A strategic choice?
Yes. It means consciously and deliberately orienting your entire organizational capacity, your constitutional laws, your economic models, your social networks, around the permanent principles of the rational order, rather than around temporary phenomena.
Look at the exact phrasing.
Yeah.
Put your reliance on the living one who does not die. The contrast being drawn there is the key to everything we've discussed today.
It is an implicit contrast. If the text says to rely on the system that does not die, it is contrasting that permanent rational order with every single human institution that will eventually die.
Every political party has a lifespan.
Yes.
Every empire rots from the inside out. Every clerical structure becomes corrupt. Every charismatic tech CEO eventually ages out, loses their edge, or dies. They are all temporary software.
All of them.
If you build your civilizational architecture on something that dies, you are mathematically guaranteeing your own eventual collapse.
This is what we refer to in systems theory as the Tapir moment.
The Tapir moment.
Yes, the inevitable systemic cascade failure. If a society builds its foundation on institutions that falsely claim permanence, it is living on borrowed time.
Think about, like, a modern tech startup that builds its entire multi-billion-dollar valuation around a single, highly eccentric founder.
Oh, we see this all the time.
Right. He is the glue holding the engineering team, which is the freshwater, and the marketing team, which is the saltwater, together. He manages all the internal APIs personally. He is the sole arbiter of truth. Investors throw money at the company because they trust him. But what happens the day that founder has a sudden heart attack?
The stock crashes, the executives go to war with each other, the system experiences catastrophic failure.
The Barzakh collapses. Because the API wasn't built on an open-source permanent protocol. It was built on one guy's proprietary mood. So Tawakkul is actually the ultimate risk management strategy. It's the systems engineer saying, do not anchor your server to this specific hardware, because the hardware will melt. Anchor it to the cloud. Anchor it to the laws of physics, the laws of sociology, and the permanent ethical principles, because those do not die.
And how do you practically execute this reliance? Because relying on permanent laws of sociology can still sound a bit, abstract.
Right, how do you actually do it?
The verse provides the methodological answer in the very next phrase, wasabi bihamdihi.
And again, convention usually translates this as sitting in a quiet room, chanting praises, and counting prayer beads. Back to the passive resignation.
But Parwez provides a linguistic analysis of classical Arabic here that completely shatters that paradigm. The root of the word sabi is sabaha. It does not mean to sit still. It does not mean to chant.
What does it mean?
It means to move swiftly with immense exhaustive physical energy within a medium.
The visual examples from the source material are incredible. They are so kinetic.
Yes. The classical Arabs used this exact root word to describe a galloping horse extending its stride to the absolute maximum, running at its highest possible capacity. They also used it to describe a swimmer, fighting against a current, using their full physical energy to propel themselves swiftly through the water.
A galloping horse and a vigorous swimmer. That is the exact opposite of sitting in a corner counting beads.
Pure kinetic exertion.
Wow.
It implies active, dynamic, exhaustive participation. So let's combine these concepts into the final operational directive here. True Tawakkul, true reliance on the permanent system, doesn't mean sitting back and letting the API run itself.
Yeah.
It means jumping into the system and swimming with all your might. It means actively, vigorously participating in the social architecture. You must use your maximum physical and intellectual effort, but you do so governed by parameters and laws that do not change.
You trust the permanent principles of buoyancy and fluid dynamics to hold you up, but you still have to kick your legs and swim. If you just sit there trusting the water, you drown. Trusting the system means you have to actively build the Barzakh. You have to actively maintain the Hidran Majura to protect the salt water from the fresh. You have to actively enforce parity between your biological nozab and your chosen sir.
You have to do the work.
You have to actively smash the personality cults that pop up in your community. And you have to do all of it with the vigorous, galloping energy of a horse, anchored to an open-source protocol that outlives any human administrator.
That is the complete socioeconomic blueprint for civilizational survival.
Let's pull the camera all the way back and synthesize this. We started by looking at the historical wreckage of societies that tried to force everyone to be exactly the same.
Right.
The Soviet projects, the colonial project, the modern algorithmic flattening. We see that homogenization always leads to death. But verses 53 through 58 of Al-Furqan, when stripped of theological sentimentality, give us the architectural alternative.
It provides the map for functional diversity. Step 1. Recognize the reality of the two Cs. Acknowledge that different communities and ideological frameworks possess distinct operating parameters. The freshwater and the saltwater exist, and both serve vital ecological functions.
Step 2. Understand that a productive, anti-fragile system requires the maintenance of their distinct functional identities. You do not build a desalination plant. Instead, you build a Barzakh, a highly functional API, and you protect it with a Hidran Majura, an actively maintained boundary that allows secure resource exchange without systemic contamination.
Step 3. You network this diverse society using the dual nodes of human organization Nasab, your biological lineage, and Sur, your chosen affinal bonds. You establish parity between the vertical and horizontal networks, rejecting the tribal unproven assertion that one is universally superior to the other.
Step 4. You protect the integrity of your APIs by smashing the personality cult. You refuse to surrender root access of your critical thinking to human institutions, clerics, or charismatic leaders who demand blind obedience, thereby saving your society from the absurdity of marrying a tree just to satisfy a flawed bureaucratic rule.
And finally, step 5. You sustain this entire complex architecture through true tawakkul. You anchor your societal organization not to temporary human hardware, but to the permanent, unchanging protocols of the rational order, the living one who does not die. And you operate within that order not passively, but with the vigorous, kinetic, galloping energy of Sabi.
The ultimate takeaway from this deep dive is a total paradigm shift. The rational order of the universe does not require homogeneity. It doesn't demand that everyone act, think, and operate exactly the same way to achieve peace.
No, it operates entirely through diversity.
Right. The failure mode of human civilization is always the same. One sea tries to become the other, or one sea tries to eliminate the other. The salt water tries to poison the fresh, or the fresh tries to dilute the salt. When that happens, the API collapses, the interface shatters, and the ecosystem dies.
The resilience of civilization is found entirely in the Barzakh. It is the ability to interact, to exchange data, to cooperate, and to share space without losing the fundamental integrity of your own operating parameters.
Which brings us right to your doorstep. I want you, the listener, to think about the complex systems you navigate every single day. Look at your workplace, look at your extended family, look at your neighborhood, or the highly polarized digital communities you scroll through. Every day, you are a body of water bumping up against a different sea.
Every single day.
When you encounter friction with the different system, a colleague with a completely different ideological framework, or an in-law with a totally different set of cultural operating parameters, what is your immediate instinct? When the fresh water meets the salt water, what do you do? Are you exhausting your emotional and intellectual energy trying to force the salt water to turn fresh?
A lot of people do.
They do. Are you running around with a terraforming kit, trying to homogenize your environment so you don't have to deal with the friction? Or are you acting like a master systems engineer? Are you investing your energy into building a healthy Barzakh? Are you actively coding a functional interface that allows both of you to exchange data, solve problems, and remain productive without destroying each other's core integrity? The future of your own social architecture, your peace of mind, and ultimately your survival depends on how you answer that question. Because human nature will always be murky, chaotic, and diverse. But the blueprint for surviving it is mathematically precise. Stop trying to mix the seas. Build a better interface. Anchor to what is permanent. And keep swimming.